let me start with a strange question. What exactly do you think you are? Not your name, not your job, not your memories. I mean physically. What are you made of? If you strip everything down far enough, ignoring all the labels and stories you've collected over your life, what remains is something surprisingly simple. You are made of atoms. Tiny, ancient building blocks that don't belong specifically to you. They aren't loyal. They don't stay fixed. They don't even recognize that they're part of a you at all. Right now, as you sit here, trillions upon trillions of atoms are arranged in a very particular way that allows you to think, to feel, to experience this moment. But those same types of atoms, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, exist everywhere. In the air around you, in the ground beneath you, in distant stars that burned long before the Earth even formed. Here's something even stranger. Many of the atoms in your body have been here for billions of years. The carbon in your cells was likely forged in the core of a star that exploded long before the solar system existed. The oxygen you're breathing right now may have passed through countless other living things, plants, animals, entire ecosystems, before becoming part of you for this brief moment. So if we take this seriously, the idea of a fixed, isolated self starts to look a little shaky, because the physical stuff that makes you up isn't new, and it isn't permanent. It's borrowed, and it's constantly changing. Every time you breathe, you exchange atoms with the environment. Every time you eat, your body breaks down molecules and rebuilds itself. Over time, a large fraction of the atoms that make up your body today will be replaced. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but gradually, quietly, continuously. So which atoms are really you? The ones you had as a child, the ones you have now, the ones you'll have in 10 years? There's no clear boundary. This leads to an uncomfortable but fascinating realization. The idea that you are a stable, well-defined physical object is more of an approximation than a fact. You feel solid. You feel continuous. But at the microscopic level, you are a dynamic system, a kind of organized flow. And this brings us to a deeper question. If the material that makes you is constantly changing, and if those materials existed long before you were born, and will continue to exist long after you're gone, then what exactly is it that begins at birth and ends at death? When people talk about ceasing to exist, they often imagine something like a light being switched off, as if something fundamental is suddenly erased from reality. But physics doesn't really allow for that kind of disappearance. There is a principle, one of the most reliable we have, that says the total amount of energy in the universe stays constant. It doesn't appear out of nowhere, and it doesn't vanish into nothing. It just changes form, moving from one arrangement to another, from one system to the next. Matter follows similar rules at the scales we're dealing with here. The atoms don't blink out of existence when something dies. They don't fall into some kind of void. They simply rearrange, continuing their participation in the larger processes of the universe. So already, at this very first step, we have to adjust our intuition. What we call disappearance might not be disappearance at all. It might just be change that we don't yet fully understand. Now take that idea a step further. If nothing fundamental about you, the atoms, the energy, actually disappears, then maybe the thing we call you isn't a solid object at all. Maybe it's something more subtle. Think again about how your body works. At this very moment, countless processes are happening inside you. Cells are breaking down and rebuilding molecules. Electrical signals are moving through your brain. Chemical reactions are constantly switching on and off. Blood is circulating, carrying oxygen and nutrients, removing waste. It's not static, it's not still. It's an ongoing activity. If you could somehow pause all of this motion, freeze every particle in place, you wouldn't have a living person anymore. You'd have a snapshot, a structure without function. And that's not the same thing as being alive. So what makes the difference? It's the pattern of activity. A useful way to think about this is to imagine a city at night, seen from above. You see lights turning on and off, cars moving through streets, people interacting, systems operating. Now imagine that all of it suddenly stops. The buildings are still there. The roads are still there. But the city, as a living system, is gone. The physical components remain, but the pattern, the organized flow that made it a functioning city, has disappeared. Something very similar is happening with you. You are not just a collection of atoms sitting together. You are a very specific arrangement of processes, happening in a coordinated way. Your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, all of these depend on patterns of activity in your brain. Tiny electrical signals moving through networks of neurons in precise ways. Chant the pattern, and you change the experience. This is something we already observe. Small changes in the brain, through injury, disease, or even temporary chemical shifts, can alter memory, personality, perception. The underlying atoms haven't vanished, but the pattern has been modified, and the you that emerges from that pattern shifts with it. So instead of thinking of yourself as a thing, it's more accurate to think of yourself as a process, like a flame. A flame looks like a stable object. You can point to it, you can describe its shape, but it isn't made of fixed material. The atoms in a flame are constantly being replaced as fuel burns and gases move. What stays consistent is not the material, but the pattern. The ongoing reaction, blow out the flame, and it seems like something has disappeared, but what actually happened? The chemical reactions stopped. The energy dispersed into the surroundings as heat and light. The atoms that were participating in the flame are still there, just no longer arranged in that particular way. The flame was never a thing in itself. It was something matter was doing. In the same way, you can think of a living human being as something matter is doing under very specific conditions, and this reframes the idea of existence in a profound way. If you are a pattern rather than a fixed object, then your existence depends on the continuation of that pattern, not on the permanence of the material. So when we ask what happens at death, we're not really asking what happens to the atoms. We already know they persist. We're asking what happens to the pattern, and that turns out to be a much more subtle and difficult question than it first appears. Once you start thinking in terms of patterns rather than objects, the idea of death begins to look very different. When a living system dies, nothing dramatic happens at the level of fundamental physics. There is no sudden violation of the rules. No energy disappears. No atoms are erased. If you could observe the process at a microscopic level, you wouldn't see anything mystical. Just a gradual breakdown of organization. Inside a living body, there is an extraordinary level of coordination. Cells maintain delicate chemical balances. Membranes regulate what enters and leaves. The brain sustains intricate electrical activity, with billions of neurons exchanging signals in precise timing patterns. This coordination is not accidental. It requires constant energy input and finely tuned conditions. Death begins when this coordination can no longer be maintained. The heart stops circulating blood effectively, or the brain loses the ability to sustain its electrical activity, or critical systems fail in a way that can't be reversed. Without oxygen and nutrients, cells can't continue their processes. Chemical gradients collapse. Electrical signals fade, but notice what's actually happening here. Nothing is being removed from the universe. Instead, the organized processes that kept everything working together begin to fall apart. The system drifts toward a more disordered state, not because something is taking it apart intentionally, but because maintaining order requires energy and control. When that control is lost, the system naturally relaxes into simpler configurations. You can think of it like a spinning top. As long as it's spinning fast enough, it stays upright, stable, almost as if it's defying gravity. But the stability isn't permanent. It depends on motion. As friction slowly drains energy from the system, the top begins to wobble, and eventually it falls. At no point does the top cease to exist. The wood, the mass, the material are all still there. What's gone is the dynamic state, the organized motion that gave it its characteristic behavior. In a similar way, a living body is a kind of sustained, highly organized motion. When that motion stops, we say the organism has died. Now consider the brain, because this is where the question becomes more personal. Your thoughts, your memories, your sense of being an observer. All of these are associated with patterns of activity in the brain. Not just static structures, but ongoing electrical and chemical processes. Networks of neurons firing in sequences, reinforcing connections, forming dynamic loops of information. When those processes stop, the experience associated with them stops as well. At least as far as current science can tell. But even here, nothing is literally destroyed in the sense of vanishing into nothingness. The molecules that made up your brain remain. The structures persist for a time before gradually breaking down further. The energy that was involved in neural activity dissipates into the surrounding environment as heat. What's lost is the active pattern, the ongoing computation, if you want to call it that was generating your conscious experience. And this distinction matters, because it shows that death is not a single moment where something fundamental disappears. It is a transition. A shift from a highly ordered, energy-driven process to a more dispersed, less organized state. The system doesn't exit reality. It changes its mode of existence within it, and once you see it this way, the question is no longer, where did it go? The better question becomes, what exactly was it that required such precise conditions to exist in the first place? Now we have to go one layer deeper, and this is where physics starts to get genuinely uncomfortable in a productive way. Because so far we've been talking about matter, energy, and patterns. But there's another concept that sits underneath all of that. And it's one of the most mysterious ideas in modern science. Information. In physics, information doesn't mean meaning in the human sense. It means something more precise. It refers to the arrangement of things, the specific state of a system. If you know exactly where every particle is and how it is moving, you have complete information about that system. Now, here's the strange part. Many physicists believe that information is never truly destroyed. At first, that sounds abstract, but think about it like this. If you scramble an egg, you've turned a structured system into a mixed one. It becomes very difficult to reconstruct the original egg from the scrambled version, but in principle, the information about how it was scrambled still exists in the physical system. It's just become extremely spread out and complex. This idea becomes much more serious in extreme physics, especially when discussing black holes. For a long time, there was a major puzzle. If something falls into a black hole, does the information about that object disappear forever? Or is it somehow preserved in a way we don't yet fully understand? Most modern research suggests that information is not destroyed, even in these extreme cases. It may be transformed, encoded in subtle ways, or spread across the universe in forms we don't yet know how to fully decode. But the key idea is that the underlying structure of reality seems to preserve information. Now, before going further, it's important to be careful. This does not mean that memories or consciousness survive in any direct or personal sense. Science does not currently support that conclusion. But it does raise a deeper and more unsettling question about what loss actually means at the fundamental level. Because if the information that describes a system is never truly erased, then in some sense, nothing that has ever existed is completely gone from the universe's description of itself. So where does that leave a human being? A human brain is not just a lump of matter. It is one of the most information-dense structures we know of in nature. Every memory, every learned skill, every habit is encoded in physical changes in neural connections and activity patterns. It is a living record of experience written into matter. When a person dies, that structure begins to dissolve. The precise organization of that information becomes harder and harder to trace as biological processes stop maintaining it. But at least in principle, the physical traces do not simply vanish instantaneously. They disperse, degrade, and become entangled with the environment. This is where things become philosophically challenging, because we naturally confuse cannot be accessed with does not exist. If information becomes unrecoverable in practice, it feels like it is gone entirely. But physics pushes us to be more precise than intuition allows. The universe, as far as we understand it, does not erase descriptions of its own past. It evolves them. So when we talk about a person existing or not existing, we have to be careful about what level we are referring to. At the level of conscious experience, the organized information that produces awareness appears to depend on active biological processes. When those processes stop, the experience stops. But at the level of physical description, the story is less clear-cut. The structure that once encoded a mind becomes part of a larger ongoing physical system. This creates a tension between two ways of thinking. The lived experience of a self that feels continuous and singular, and the physical description of a system that is always transforming, never truly erased. And science is still trying to understand how these two descriptions relate, if they can be fully unified at all. This is where the real difficulty begins, not in physics itself, but in the human mind trying to interpret what physics is telling us. The problem is that we experience reality in a very specific way. You don't experience yourself as a pattern or a process. You experience yourself as a continuous presence. There is a point of view that feels stable. There is a sense of I am here now, and I was here before, and I will be here next. That feeling is extremely strong. It is the foundation of how you navigate the world. But that sense of continuity is not something physics directly describes. It is something the brain constructs. Your brain is constantly building a model of the world and placing you inside it as the central observer. This model is incredibly useful. It helps you predict consequences, remember past events, and plan future actions. Without it, survival would be nearly impossible. But usefulness does not always mean fundamental truth. Let's consider a simple example. When you watch a film, you experience continuous motion. Characters move smoothly, time flows, events unfold. But in reality, the film is just a sequence of still frames projected rapidly. Your brain fills in the gaps and creates the illusion of continuity. Something similar happens with your sense of self. Neuroscience suggests that your experience of being a continuous you is constructed from rapidly updated snapshots of brain activity. Each moment of awareness is slightly separate from the next, but your brain stitches them together into a seamless narrative. This stitching is so effective that you never notice the seams. Now here's where the difficulty arises. When we talk about death, we instinctively imagine the continuation of that narrative being suddenly cut off. From the inside, that feels like a transition into nothingness, because all experience is filtered through that narrative structure, but physics does not contain that narrative. It contains states, transitions, and interactions. It does not assign meaning to continuity or discontinuity. It simply describes change. So when the brain stops generating the processes that produce conscious experience, There is no longer a system maintaining that internal model of self. From the perspective of that system, there is no further experience to be had. This is difficult to intuit because we cannot directly imagine the absence of experience. Any attempt to do so still involves experience. Even the thought of nothingness is still a thought occurring in consciousness. This creates a kind of cognitive boundary. We can describe the end of experience conceptually, but we cannot simulate it subjectively. That is one reason humans struggle so much with this idea. Our tools for understanding reality are built inside the very system we are trying to analyze. We are using a self-referential instrument. Another reason is emotional. The brain strongly resists models that break its own narrative continuity. That resistance is not irrational. It is part of how living systems preserve stability. But it can make purely physical descriptions feel incomplete or unsatisfying. From a scientific standpoint, however, the picture is consistent so far. The continuity we feel is a product of ongoing brain activity. When that activity ceases, the mechanism producing that continuity also ceases. But what remains scientifically unresolved is how exactly subjective experience arises in the first place. We can correlate consciousness with brain processes, map its dependencies, and observe its breakdown under certain conditions, but we do not yet have a complete explanation of why any physical system should produce an inner experience at all. This is known as the hard problem of consciousness. And until that is solved, there will always be a gap between the physical description of what happens and the lived experience of what it feels like. That gap is where most of our confusion comes from. There is another way to approach this problem, and it may feel more intuitive than abstract physics. Instead of thinking about particles or information or brain activity, we can think in terms of waves. A wave is not a thing in the usual sense. It is a pattern of disturbance moving through a medium. The ocean is the simplest example. When you look at a wave, it appears to be a single object traveling across the water. But if you try to track a specific drop of water, you find that it mostly moves up and down rather than forward. What travels is not the water itself, but the pattern. This distinction is subtle but important. A wave has no permanent identity. It is defined entirely by its form and motion at a given moment. When the conditions that support the wave change, the wave disappears, but nothing fundamental is lost. The water is still there. The energy is still there. Only the organized structure has changed. Now imagine extending this idea beyond water. Sound is also a wave. It travels through air as pressure variations. Light behaves like a wave in many contexts, even though it is also described as particles in quantum physics. In every case, what we call a wave is really a temporary organization of something more basic. This gives us a useful analogy for thinking about living systems. A human being can be seen as a highly complex, self-sustaining wave of matter and energy. Not in a poetic sense, but in a structural one. There is continuous flow, continuous interaction, and continuous transformation. Nothing inside you is static. Everything is in motion, yet the overall pattern remains recognizable over time. You wake up each day as you, even though the underlying components are constantly shifting. So what holds this wave together? In physical terms, it is a combination of energy flow and structural constraints. Your body maintains gradients, differences in temperature, chemistry, and electrical charge that allow organized processes to continue. Your brain maintains patterns of neural activity that reinforce certain states over others. As long as energy is supplied and structure is maintained, the wave persists. But like all waves, this persistence is conditional. If the supporting conditions change beyond a certain point, the pattern can no longer sustain itself. The wave collapses, not because something is taken away, but because the structure that maintained it is no longer stable. Now, here is where the analogy becomes emotionally difficult for people, but scientifically straightforward. When a wave in the ocean ends, we do not say that something has been destroyed. We say the pattern has dispersed. The energy continues in different forms. The water remains part of the ocean. The system continues, just without that particular structure. If we apply this strictly to living systems, then what we call death is the loss of a sustained biological pattern. The matter remains, the energy remains, but the organized wave that we associate with a living person no longer persists. What makes this perspective unusual is that it removes the sharp boundary we often assume exists between existing and not existing. Instead, existence becomes a matter of degree of organization and persistence of pattern. A wave can be strong, stable, and long-lasting, or weak, short-lived, and quickly dispersed. But it is never fundamentally separate from the medium it moves through. In that sense, a living human being is not separate from the universe either. It is a temporary configuration within it, and when that configuration dissolves, it does not leave the system. It simply becomes indistinguishable from the larger background of which it was always a part. At this point, it is important to slow down and clearly separate what physics actually tells us from what we are tempted to imagine it might be telling us. We know a few solid things. We know that matter and energy do not simply vanish. We know that complex structures, like living brains, depend on very specific physical conditions to function. We also know that when those conditions stop being maintained, the structure breaks down and the associated processes cease. But there is a tendency to take those facts and extend them into places where science has not yet gone. And that is where confusion begins. For example, it is very easy to hear that nothing is destroyed and quietly translate that into nothing is truly lost in any meaningful sense. But those are not the same claim. The first is a statement about conservation laws in physics. The second is a philosophical interpretation that depends on what you think counts as meaningful. Similarly, it is easy to hear that the brain encodes information and assume that means the full richness of a person is preserved somewhere in the universe in a retrievable form. But encoding does not guarantee preservation in any practical or reconstructible sense. A broken mirror still contains all the glass, but the image it once reflected is no longer accessible in the same way. This is where science is very careful and human intuition is often too fast. We can describe the physical components of a person. We can map brain activity, measure electrical signals, track chemical processes, and observe how these change over time. We can even predict certain aspects of behavior based on those measurements. But there is still a gap between describing the structure and explaining the subjective experience. That gap matters here, because when people think about survival after death, they are usually not thinking about atoms or energy. They are thinking about continuity of experience. The sense of being inside a perspective. The feeling of being the same observer over time, as it currently stands, does not directly describe that inner perspective. It describes systems from the outside. So when we say the physical components continue, that does not automatically address the question of whether the subjective point of view continues. That is a separate and unresolved problem. It is also worth noting that human thinking is strongly biased toward continuity. Our brains are built to track stable objects, stable identities, and stable narratives. This was extremely useful for survival. If you had to rebuild your sense of reality from scratch every moment, you would not function effectively in the world. But this same feature makes it difficult to accept discontinuous or non-intuitive descriptions of existence. We prefer to imagine that things either fully exist or fully stop existing, because that fits our cognitive framework. Nature, however, does not always respect those categories. At the microscopic level, systems are continuously transitioning between states. Boundaries are often fuzzy. Identity depends on scale and perspective. A cell is alive in one context, but its components are not alive in isolation. A person is a single entity in everyday language, but a collection of interacting systems in physical description. So when we talk about life and death, we are not describing a single clean switch. We are describing a gradual loss of organization at multiple levels. And that means our language often simplifies something that is, in reality, far more continuous and layered than it appears. Science does not eliminate the mystery here. It refines it. It replaces sharp answers with more precise questions. And in this case, it forces us to be very careful about where our intuitions stop and where measurable reality begins. If we put everything together now, something interesting starts to emerge, not as a final answer, but as a clearer way of seeing the question itself. We began with the idea of you, and we slowly stripped away assumptions. First, we saw that the physical matter in your body is not permanent or exclusive to you. Then we saw that what we call you is not the matter itself, but the pattern of activity that organizes that matter. Then we saw that this pattern depends on continuous biological processes, especially in the brain. When those processes stop, the organized activity stops as well. At each step, something that felt solid became more fluid. But there is still a temptation to ask a final question. So where do you go? Physics, strictly speaking, does not contain a concept of going in the way we intuitively mean it here. It describes configurations of matter and energy evolving over time. When a configuration changes, physics describes the new configuration. It does not track a self moving through states, unless that self is defined within the system itself as a pattern. This is a subtle but important shift. The universe does not appear to label things as you and not you. Those labels are applied by a mind trying to organize experience. From the perspective of physics, there are only fields, particles, interactions, and evolving structures. So when a living human being exists, what is present is a highly organized, self-maintaining structure that we interpret as a person. When that structure breaks down, what remains is the same underlying physical reality, just no longer organized in that specific way. This leads to a strange but important realization. The distinction between existing and not existing may depend heavily on the level at which you are describing the system. At the level of everyday experience, existence means being a continuous center of awareness. At the level of biology, existence means maintaining life processes. At the level of physics, existence means being part of the ongoing state of the universe, regardless of form. All of these are valid descriptions, but they do not necessarily refer to the same thing. This is why the question of what happens after death resists a simple answer. It is not just a scientific question. It is also a question about which level of description we are using and what we expect that description to preserve. If we expect physics to preserve the feeling of being a subject, then we are asking it to do something it was never designed to describe. If we expect biology to define identity beyond its functional processes, we are extending it beyond its domain. And if we expect personal experience to be independent of physical processes, we are entering a domain where current science has no confirmed framework. So we are left with a layered picture. At one layer, the body stops functioning as an integrated system. At another, the patterns that generate conscious experience cease. At another, the physical components continue to exist and participate in other processes. And at yet another, the universe simply continues its evolution without any loss in total substance. Nothing steps outside the system. Nothing leaves the universe. What changes is the arrangement, not the existence of the underlying reality. The difficulty is that we are trying to map a first-person perspective onto a third-person description of nature, and those two viewpoints do not align perfectly. Science can describe what happens to systems. It is still working on fully explaining why any system gives rise to an inner point of view at all. Until that is resolved, the question of you after death will remain partly a question about physics and partly a question about how consciousness fits into physics in the first place. And that is where the boundary of current knowledge actually sits.